Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardozo Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon.
Our family is already living or has been living in Amsterdam for about 350 years. It seems that our family came first from Spain. Afterwards they went to Portugal. That's after the Inquisition in 1492. And once they were in Portugal and there 150 years later the Inquisition started as well, they seem to have moved to Amsterdam. So in the 17th century, they arrived in Amsterdam around that time. They may have been before in Italy and different places, not very clear. And at that time, the Portuguese Spanish Jews were just coming to Amsterdam at large. They built a community there, mainly people who had no Jewish background at all, but they were Christians as far as their beliefs were concerned, but they wanted to return to the Jewish tradition, but they didn't know what it was. But there were some rabbis they brought with them, or they came later, and they started to invest in them and to give them Jewish education. And so slowly they built out of that first 3 small Jewish Portuguese Spanish communities, which later on became one community. They came from many different parts of Spain and Portugal. And out of that became the famous Portuguese Spanish community in Amsterdam, which was flourishing in the 17th, 18th century and up till the Holocaust. And then it was nearly completely wiped out. On one Shabbat, on one Saturday, when the Nazis walked into the synagogue and they took all the Jews with. So that's from where my father comes. My father was raised in a assimilated Jewish Portuguese Spanish family. Very little religious background, but very Jewish in the social sense of the word and in the cultural sense of the word. So Friday night was a special night. They did not eat kosher or anything like that, but there were certain things they wouldn't eat because that was the tradition going back hundreds of years. And they spoke a certain Amsterdam Jewish language, which was a language on its own. And my father grew up over there. He had no opportunity to start to study or anything like that. He went into business. And in a Jewish firm, he meets my mother, who was a secretary in that Jewish firm. She came from a real Christian background. And they basically fell in love. That is just before the Holocaust starts, in 1938, something like that. And then they decided to get married. And a few days after they got married, the Germans walked into Germany. And my mother said to my father, you know what? Bring your whole family to our home in Amsterdam, in the south of Amsterdam. I will hide all of them in this little, very small little apartment. That means my grandmother, who I knew after the war. I was born in 1946. My uncles, an aunt, and some other people. My mother took them all in. And she did as if she was the only one living in this place. Everybody was hiding, exactly the story of Anne Frank. Behind cupboards, behind double walls, underground, whatever it was. And she managed to get them through this. They were living upstairs and downstairs in that street where they were living. There were Dutch people who were collaborating with the Nazis. And it was therefore very risky. And if my mother went out to get some food somewhere, everybody had to be totally quiet because officially there was nobody else living in that house but my mother, while the place was packed with people. And she managed to do that, except that one brother of my father didn't dare to hide and listened to the Germans and left for Germany and never came back. I'm called after him. My non-Jewish name is Nico and my Jewish name is Nathan, and that's basically his name. So he never came and never returned. The rest of the family all made it, only because of my mother, who managed to get all the food which was required. Well, you know, I don't have to tell you the stories. They are beyond understanding, to be quite honest. And then after the war in 46, I was born. 48, I have a younger brother who's a dentist, who was born at that time, in the same home where they were all hidden. And my parents basically had decided that they really wouldn't want to have a religious home or anything like that. My mother had walked out on Christianity. My father was assimilated, very proud about his being Jewish, very proud about being a Portuguese-Spanish Jew, and he was always a member of the Portuguese-Spanish synagogue. But my father was really a little bit of a follower of Spinoza, who was another very famous Jew in the Portuguese-Spanish synagogue in Amsterdam, who became a world-class philosopher. And my brother and I, we were brought up in that kind of world. Spinoza, my father was a businessman, but his interest was very much with philosophy, and especially Spinoza. Spinoza very strongly objected against the Jewish tradition and objected against the Bible. That's in itself a long and very interesting story. But because I started to read with my father Spinoza, in which he attacked the Jewish tradition, I said to my dad, what is this Jewish tradition all about? You are Jewish, I'm half Jewish. And what happened as well was my mother was raised in the home of my father's parents. She had lost her parents before the war, and they had taken her in after she had met my father. So my mother was raised basically in a Jewish environment and always felt that she was Jewish, but she wasn't. And so we had Friday night, we had very specific issues. I remember we had a Christmas tree on one side of the room and a menorah on the other side of the room. I think we lit them both at the same time. I don't remember that story exactly anymore. But my mother was very strongly identified with Jews. And all their friends were Jews. There were nearly no non-Jews there. So I was raised in that very strange environment together with my brother. And when we started to read Spinoza, and I started to understand there's something about this Jewishness which is very, very interesting, I better need to know more about this. And so I started to read books. I asked my father to buy books for me, which he did. And I got myself deeply involved in this, and I found this extremely interesting and challenging. And so slowly but surely I got more knowledge about it. And when I was about 16 years old, I said to my dad, I think that I have to become officially Jewish. It's basically your fault. You basically constantly kept telling us about our Jewish background. And so I walked up to the chief rabbi of the Portuguese-Spanish community at the time. He was called Chacham, which means the wise one. Rodriguez Pereira, Shlomo Rodriguez Pereira, which is also a double Portuguese-Spanish name, like Lopes Cardozo. And I told him about my wishes. And he said, okay, but you have to study, you have to know much more and so on. So I said, okay, tell me what I have to do. And that's what I did. And I had to go through all sort of examinations and other things. And one day I actually did a conversion. I never saw myself as a non-Jew because we were only living among Jews and within a Jewish environment. But according to Jewish law, I was not. So that is where it started. My brother was very close to do the same thing. On the end, decided not to do it because he had a non-Jewish girlfriend, but In my many conversations with him, he said, if I would have met a Jewish girl, I would definitely have made that move as well and also converted. But then something very interesting happened. Years after that, when my mother was about 50 years old, she said, I also need to convert. So she converted as well. And my parents got married 3 months before I got married with my wife by the same rabbi in the same synagogue in the Portuguese Spanish in Amsterdam. So that's obviously a very unusual case. And my mother then started to have a kosher home. And my parents started to keep Shabbat and many other things which are part of the Jewish tradition. So by the time that my children were born, they had on both sides 4 Jewish grandparents. And they knew about the story. We always told them exactly what had happened. But this is the way how it came about. And then I said, I need to know still more about this. So they told me you should go to yeshiva, which is a Talmudic college. So I went to England. There was no such institution in Amsterdam. So I went to England and I went there. It was an ultra-Orthodox place. And I liked the studies, but the environment was far removed from anything I was used to. You know, people walking in black hats, everything. But the studies and also the teachers were outstanding, very humble people with tremendous wisdom. And I don't know how, but I stayed there for 8 years. And at the end of the 7th year, the rabbi said to me, why don't you do your examinations and you will be officially a rabbi? So I said, I never planned to be a rabbi. I was thinking about going back to university and do studies in philosophy, perhaps becoming a professor there or something like that. But what really happened is, so I became a rabbi. Basically, yeah. But till this day, I'm very interested in the Portuguese-Spanish background, in the world view of that world, which is an interesting world on its own, and what also I think should play a big role today within the Jewish world, and which it does not. The Ashkenazi world, which is the larger Jewish community, has overtaken somehow the way how we move the Jewish tradition forward. Well, I think that the Sephardi, the Portuguese Spanish, they have a different view on certain things, and I'm trying to push that concept as well. I personally believe that it is this coming back to the Jewish roots is coming about because of several issues. First of all, in Spain and Portugal, there are, if not millions, then hundreds of thousands of Christians walking around who are clearly from Jewish descent. There was obviously a lot of assimilation between Jews and non-Jews when they stopped being able to be Jewish, and the Inquisition pushed them into Christianity. Whatever you hide, whatever you try to do away with, psychologically we know that at a certain moment it just comes back again. And what happens psychologically, I would say, it comes in the subconscious. Certain things which go back a few hundred years suddenly somehow come back, and they start to make an impression on the subconscious of people. Something is telling them in their DNA, whatever name you want to give it, there is something about you which is different from perhaps other people. So people are at this moment going through this kind of experience. You hear it more and more. You hear it also in Israel for many people coming from these backgrounds, and they come here and they say, you know what, I feel at home here. Why is that? And the answer is that because it is somewhere in your blood, going back so many hundreds of years. I think there's a second thing as well. People are looking for meaning today. There's a big problem today going on in the Christian church, and that is many people who are part of that church are not satisfied with what that church has to offer. And Therefore, they're looking for also opportunities. So it is an existential issue as well. People want to know, why am I living? What is the purpose of life? Who are we? There's a lot of wonder going about. People are, I think, becoming more and more aware of the amazing experience of being alive. And they are asking questions and they need answers. And what they do is, and this happens quite often, is they go on the internet and they go and look into books, and then they find that the Jewish tradition is the root of Christianity, it is the root of Islam, it is the root of Western civilization in many, many ways. So therefore they try to get back to the sources, to the very root where it all started. So suddenly something opens up to them which they were never aware of. So there are psychological, cultural, and also matters taking place. Now, it could quite well be that it has something to do with the concept, as is found in the prophets, of the ingathering of the exiles, and that perhaps we are living in the earlier parts of that new world, and that therefore it becomes even stronger. It's very difficult now to say what happens. We can only say this in also 150 years. We look back to our days and we can say, you know, now we can see why this happened. Well, first of all, the Sephardi world also paid a very heavy price in the Holocaust, especially those who were living in Europe, in Greece, in Turkey. There was anti-Semitism as much against the Sephardi community as there was against the Ashkenazi one. I tell you an interesting story. I don't know how much this is worthwhile knowing for this particular documentary, but when the Nazis came to Holland and they wanted to deport all the Jews to Auschwitz and Birkenau and all these places, and the Dutch Jews were the first ones to get there. They were the first people who were picked up by the Nazis. There was an attempt made by some non-Jewish professors who were medical professors to prove to the Nazis that the Portuguese Spanish Jews were really not Jewish. How did they do that? I have these studies. They did that by showing that the anatomical build-up of their bodies, of their physical appearance, was Spanish and was not Jewish. And they said these people are not really Jewish, they are just Jewish by faith, by belief, but they really don't belong to the Jewish people. So you should not deport them because they don't belong to the Jews. And in the beginning, the Nazis bought into this. My father never trusted this and said to my mother at the time, one day they will change their mind and they will take the Portuguese Spanish Jews as well. And that's exactly what happened. But there was an attempt made at that time to make that distinction. But obviously, all the Jews who were living in Spain before the Inquisition came originally from Babylon, from the Middle East, from Israel, and then moved after the destruction of the temple. They moved to all these different places, and one of them was Spain, and later on Portugal. They were definitely Jewish. Only there they assimilated when they could no longer live a Jewish life. But I think that what is happening today has a lot to do with the fact that the Jewish values, which are found within Christianity as well, after all, Christianity is rooted within the Jewish tradition, have become under great strain today. The Western world, as we see around us, is very often moving away from this, what people call Judeo-Christian tradition. And the secularization there is such that often you pay a very heavy price of it. Certain values are gone, certain facts which were always taken for granted are no longer taken for granted. And there's a lot of things going on which is not healthy on many levels. So Christianity, already for quite a long time, is getting into difficulties because many of its people are walking out. When they walk out, they look for something else. They can't find it, basically. And what happens then is they as I mentioned before, they start looking for their roots, and then they find that much of Christianity is rooted within that Jewish tradition. Now here anti-Semitism also comes in, because anti-Semitism in many ways is also the hate against Jewish Christian values. That is to say, since the Christian values, many of them which were brought by Jesus and later by Paul to the West, are really Jewish values. The very fact that there is only one God and that one has to live a moral life and man is created in the image of God, and all these matters are all issues which are part of the Jewish tradition, adopted by Christianity. So when we speak about anti-Semitism, we have to understand the following. I once spoke about this and I wrote about this, and that is that while the official reading is that the non-Jewish world or the anti-Semitic world hates us, the Jews, for having killed Jesus, the truth about it is that they hate us because we gave them Jesus. We gave them Jesus. After all, Jesus was a religious Jew in every sense of the word. People don't realize that at all. He was something of a rabbi, and also he may have broken away from something of the Jewish tradition. He did not create Christianity. It was Paul, who was also a Jew, who later on created the Christianity we know today via the Catholic Church. But we have to realize that the problem which the West today has with the Jews is that they hold us responsible for bringing moral values to the Western world via Jesus and via Christianity. Now, many Christians are not aware of that. But since today much more knowledge is available, they get to start to understand this and say, but wait a moment, it didn't start in Christianity. It started in the Jewish tradition. So therefore, we feel this pull because we want to hold on to these values. And we know that where we can find them in the most original form is within the Jewish tradition. So there is a movement today taking place of let's try to get back where Christianity started. And once you start to go there, you will end up with the Jewish tradition. And that is no doubt part of what is happening today and what we constantly hear people coming up from many different places and say basically, we want to know where it started. Christianity started in the Jewish tradition, and Christianity could never have made it if not because of the Jewish tradition. And that's, I think, very important because it has to do with the very reason why anti-Semitism is there. It is basically also anti-Christian. But Christians don't realize that because they don't dig enough into history to know from where do their values come. And Christianity has a problem in general, and that is that the paganism, which was also very much part of the Roman world, where Paul went after Jesus had died and where he brought these values to the Romans, the paganism got mixed up with Jewish values. And there was an enormous tension between these two worlds. And that was very hard for Christians to live by because they were pulled on one side to a kind of polytheism with many gods. And on the other side, they were pulled against by the Jewish tradition, was speaking only about one moral God. And that must have created a lot of tension, psychological tension, where they really said, but wait a moment, what is this Jewish tradition, this Christian tradition doing to us? It tells us how to live a moral life. Who says that I want to live a moral life? I have also priorities. If you look into the work of Hitler, יימח שמו, as we say in Hebrew, may he be forgotten and being completely erased. The truth is that if you read his work, Mein Kampf, he writes there that the main reason why he hates Jews is because they brought ethics and morality to the world. That's where it starts. And as long as we therefore don't convince our people, Jews and non-Jews, that we must go back to Jewish values to build a better world, you're going to have a continuation of anti-Semitism. I object against, all the people constantly speaking about how are we going to fight anti-Semitism. I wrote just an article about this. And I said, my dear friends, you can't fight anti-Semitism if you don't understand its nature, from where it comes. You have to go to its roots. And the roots are that it objects against Jewish Christian values. By the way, the person who said that and who has written about it was Sigmund Freud. He was one of the first people who said anti-Semitism is rooted in the fact that we have given Jesus to the world, not that we killed him. But everything was turned around to make it into a different story from what it really was. What really needs to happen today is to create a Jewish tradition for non-Jews. Not that they have to become Jewish. The Jewish tradition doesn't believe that everybody has to become Jewish so that you are saved, let's say. But it does believe that there are certain basic values which everybody must take on to be decent people and to be righteous people. And since Christianity has failed us, and that doesn't mean to say that Christianity hasn't done a lot of good stuff as well, which is no doubt true, and Islam is definitely failing us at this very moment, I say to my colleagues, listen, we created Christianity and we also created Islam in the sense that we laid the foundations for them. Now we need to lay the foundations of a new religion for the non-Jewish world, which must be again built on the great values of Jewish morality and ethics, as they are found within the Bible, within Tanakh. And we now have to bring even more Jewish values into their world. For example, a certain amount of kosher food. Doesn't mean to say that they have to keep everything like we Jews do, but the concept of kosher food is an important value system. Let's share that with them. Let's share the Shabbat with them. Let's share the issues which relate to sexuality with them. There are very important values within the Jewish tradition which would help these people to find a better way of living and a more meaningful way of living. So I think that we are at a stage now where in the next 100 years we will see that a new religion will come into existence, which again is rooted within the Jewish tradition, but with even more Jewish values and even rituals, because the world is in need of it. It is basically asking for it. The Noahide laws, there are 7 laws, which are the basics. You know, several things which one should not do, like killing, like, sexual immorality and matters like that. But that's not enough. I would always say that the 7 commandments of Noah are the 10 commandments as we have them in the Jewish world. Yeah, the 10 commandments, by the way, really exist out of 17 or 18 commandments, but we call them 10 commandments because they were given in 10 stages. And out of these 10 came forth what we call the 613 commandments, as we find them in the Torah, in the Bible. And we now have to do the same thing with the 7 commandments of Noah. We have to make them to grow so that they will spread and they will have all sorts of side laws or side moral principles by which you actually can build a religious way of living, which is also, and most important, and first of all, a moral way of living. But they are rooted in the 7, like Jewish law is rooted in the 10 commandments. So it's the same principle, but it still has to grow. It is definitely important for Israeli society for the Anusim to come back. But it only would work when there is a strong Jewish identity with these Anusim. Many of them have it, but many of them don't. They are Anusim because we know they came from this Jewish background, but there's little interest. And there is no point in starting to force them into that. But those who knock on our door, and perhaps we have to do a little bit more outreach here as well, by going to them and making them aware who they are and from where they come. Yes, there is an interest in that. It depends a lot on whom you are asking. There are certain parts of Israeli society which are very involved in that, and there are some who say, we don't know if we should do that because it would be overwhelming and we would not be able to cope with it. There's even talk about in India and in the Far East, there are millions of people walking around who are claiming that they are from one of the tribes. So there was many years ago a debate in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, what to do with all these people because they were living under very difficult conditions. They knocked on the door of the Israeli state and they said, listen, we are your brothers and your sisters, can we come? Which would have meant millions and millions, if not more than that, coming. Now, the state said at the time, we can't cope with that. We are economically, and even as far as space is concerned, we are not yet ready to do this. We are now many years later, and no doubt there is a need to look into it as well. There are today quite a few important organizations which are dealing with these issues. Israel is, however, first of all, confronted with another problem. There are many people from Jewish descent, not specifically from Sephardic descent, from the Anusim world, but from Russia, from other places in Europe, who have grandparents who were Jewish. They have come to this country, and they are, according to Jewish law, they are not Jewish, and they serve here in the Israeli army. They're part of our society. Our first concern at the moment is to bring them into the Jewish people, because if we don't do that, then we will be left with a large portion of, let's call it non-Jewish Jews who are living in this country, who want to marry our children, but at this moment it is not yet possible to do that because they're not fully Jewish, and we need to deal with that first. My opinion there is that we have to do everything to bring these young people to the Jewish tradition and to make them to take and to make a conversion, to convert. And then in a later stage, when we have solved that problem, we can go to the Anusim problem on a much larger scale. But it's probably a little too early yet to do that. But that doesn't mean to say that the people coming from these particular places and who are the Anusim or the children of Anusim, they should do everything and anything to try to find their roots and to know more about the Jewish tradition, and the way as I did it as well, because it can only be beneficial. Nobody needs to become Jewish, but if you want, they say in Hebrew, mevakasha, please come in. I think that the first thing what they have to realize is that there is very good cause of being proud about their Jewish ancestry. They have to understand that they belong to a very special people called the Jewish people, that probably most of the time they have been misinformed about these people because of all the anti-Semitism around and the constant criticism on Israel, which most of the time is completely unfair and is a form of anti-Semitism. They need first of all to take a stand as far as the Jewish people are concerned. These are my people. I am perhaps not fully part yet and I feel lonely, but there are my roots. That's from where I came. I have to know more about it. Let me get objective information about it. Let me learn about the Jewish tradition. And in the second stage, I will then have to ask myself, do I really want to do something with it? Do I want to become Jewish? Do I want to become closer to this particular tradition? But it starts with pride. There's a feeling like, here is an unusual people. People don't realize how unusual the Jewish people are. The Jewish people is 4,000 years old, right? We are the smallest nation in the world. We don't count in any way number-wise. We are less than 1% of mankind. It is very remarkable that the whole world is always busy with us, while in fact nobody should ever have heard about us. There are tribes in Africa which are much larger than the sum total of all the Jewish people in the world, and you have never heard about their name, you don't know anything about them. But when it comes about this even smaller people called the Jewish people, everybody's busy with it. Every focus is always in politics on also levels. It is on the Jewish people, to the bad and to the good. They use it against us and they use it in favor of us. We survived the impossible. Jews, throughout the whole of Jewish history, have been confronted with anti-Semitism in the most terrible ways. The Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, all of them have been trying to wipe us out. Nobody succeeded. More than that, most of the nations who stood up against us are gone. The Romans, there's not one of them left. The old Greeks are gone. The Persians are gone. All of them are gone. The only people still around today who stood up against us are the Germans. They're still there. But history teaches us that anybody who stands up against the Jewish people ultimately will disappear. That is what history teaches us, clearly. There is no way around that. And that should straight away make people say, what's going on with these people? Why are they holding out while for the last 2,000 years, up till 1948, they have not been living in their own country, surrounded only by, most of the time, a lot of animosity, especially before the Holocaust in Europe, right? And still, you survive? That is basically saying that you are violating the laws of history. There are laws of history. There are regulations in history. And if certain things happen to you, you disappear. And that happened to the Irish, it happened to everybody else except for one people, the Jews. The Jews just violated these laws and continued to live, as if they were living somewhere else on a different planet. And so they survived. Then there is another thing which they should be very proud about. The enormous contribution which the Jewish people have made to this world is out of all proportion. We gave them the Bible, we gave them the New Testament, we gave them Jesus, we gave them Paul, we gave them the greatest scientists and so on, out of proportion. I'm not saying that there were not great people in the non-Jewish world, but percentage-wise, we should never have been influential at all. If today you look to the list which I get every year for all the Nobel Prize people who received the Nobel Prize, an enormous amount of Jewish names there, out of all proportion. That should make people to ask, what's going on with this little group people called the Jews? Then there's the Holocaust. 6 million of Jews are wiped out, right? Everybody thought that's the end of the Jewish people. They won't survive this. What happens 3 years afterwards, 1948, the Jews go home after 2,000 years. They say, you know what, let's go home. Nobody likes us in Europe, so let's go home. Where's our home? Israel. So we go home to Israel, right? That's the wrong place to go because everybody there doesn't want you to become there, to go there. But they came there. And this has been so incredibly overwhelming for many non-Jews and specifically for anti-Semitic people that they say, what are these Jews doing over here? They go back after 4,000 years, after all what we have tried to do to destroy them. Now they come back, they built a state, they built a community, they have an army, they have a Knesset and government and so on. And they are, in technology, they are far advanced nearly over everybody else. That must make people to think twice before they judge the Jews and before they understand what it means to be Jewish. So anybody who is from an Anusi background, from a Sephardic background or a Jewish background, must say, wait a moment, I belong to something very special, very unusual. It nearly doesn't make any sense, but that is the reality under which we live. The contributions have been enormous. The survival is beyond imagination and beyond understanding. As I said, all the great ethical values came from the Jewish tradition, via Christianity, via other different countries or religions, whatever it is, but that's what you belong to, that's what you're part of, so be proud of it. Whether or not you want to join this whole thing, that's up to you. But at least be proud of it. And under all circumstances, therefore, fight anti-Semitism, because the fight against anti-Semitism is a fight of favor, in favor of you against people who also hate you. You may be Christians, you may be today Catholics, but ultimately this is anti-Semitism against you. And if you don't fight it, then you're doing a great disservice, not only to the Jews, but also to yourselves. you have to be proud from where you come, what your roots are. Start reading about it. Start following whatever classes there are on internet. Read up on it and so on. And you suddenly will find out that you come from some very special, unusual background. But I think this is the major issue here. Especially when you're looking for meaning and you want to have a higher purpose to life. Here is the plan, here's the road, here's the way how to go. And I know out of experience that this works for many people. Anti-Semitism is first of all a form of ignorance, of not knowing who Jews are, what they stand for, being indoctrinated by all sorts of completely false ideas about them, which have partially also their root in Christianity, because Christianity started and waged a war ultimately against the Jewish tradition, probably out of some kind of jealousy that they were not the first ones. Anybody with Spanish names has a good chance in these countries that he or she is of a Jewish background. If they are honest with themselves, they should look into this, no doubt. And they should know that we know today that there have been anti-Semitic people in the past who were nearly violent anti-Semitic people, later had to find out that they were actually Jews and had to change their minds about it. I know about a few cases like that where they were involved in deep anti-Semitic movements till somebody made them aware that they themselves are Jews, so they are fighting themselves. And they were so terribly shocked by it that they wanted to know, so what is this Jewishness all about? And then they discovered a completely different world and they realized that everything was said about Jews was completely false. And this may happen to anybody in all these countries, and they should be aware of it. They may be fighting the wrong fight because they may be fighting against themselves without being aware of it, and they will do a lot of harm to themselves and to their children and to their grandchildren. Ultimately, we know one thing from history. You can fight it, your Jewish background. One day, one of your grandchildren will confront you with it and will ask you, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me what this is all about? No information at all. You have done me a great disservice, to say the least. And you're fighting it? So you are fighting against your own grandchild. How can you do that? That should shock everybody and say, wait a moment, I have to think twice before I get involved in any of these movements.
Thank you again for joining me on this edition of Proclaiming Justice. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information about how you can get involved, please visit our website at pjtn.org. As a PJTN Watchman, you can help us keep up the fight to preserve our freedom for our children and their children for such a time as this.